The title of this training is The Inherent Strengths in Kinship Families. I'm very excited about developing and presenting this material for you. And I'm excited. It's not just another training for me. For me, it was really a labor of caring, a labor of passion, and for three reasons. One, it's allowing me to recognize and to really celebrate what's special about you, the kinship caregiver. And when I say special, I'm talking about what are the special strengths that's required of you and is required of someone who is willing to raise the children who are not biologically theirs, but are willing to raise the children of other friends and families. So I want to talk about those strengths and celebrate that. The second reason that I'm enjoying doing this training is because it also allows me an opportunity to explain how you use those strengths, how you use those strengths to nurture these children, to care for these children, and to even heal these children from some of the trauma that they've experienced that was a result of them coming into your care. The third reason, and for me maybe the most important reason, is because it's allowing me to highlight for professionals and agencies and organizations why these strengths are the reasons that kinship caregivers should be given first and preferable consideration over adoption and foster care when children are not able to stay with their parents. And I'm going to repeat that. The third reason for doing this training is to highlight for professionals and agencies and organizations why these strengths are the reasons why kinship caregivers should be given preferential consideration over adoption and foster care when children are unable to stay with their parents. Now let me describe this training for you. This training is divided into 5 modules. The first module is called Attachment. And in that module, I'll be talking about what's special about the children's attachment with you that makes kinship care so effective. The second module that I'm going to talk about is called Legacy. And in that module, I'll be talking about how kinship care can be, how you as kinship caregivers can use your legacy, your traditions, your values to interrupt cycles that may have resulted in the children coming into care. So it's going to be about legacies and the strength of legacies and how legacies can interrupt cycles. And in the third module, I'll be talking about identity. And in that module, I'll be talking about how kinship caregivers can prevent the loss of multiple identities that children experience when placed in foster care and adoption. And the fourth module is called Healing. In that module, I'll be talking about how you as caregivers help the children heal from the loss and the grief that they experience when separated from their parents, and even heal and recover from the trauma that they may have experienced that resulted in the reasons of them being placed with you. And the fifth module, which to me is maybe your strongest strength as caregivers, is your ability to assume the roles and the responsibilities that are necessary for keeping the children out of the system if they're unable to remain with their families. And I'll repeat that one again too. I think the strength of kinship caregivers is their ability to assume those roles and responsibilities that keep the children out of adoption and foster care when they're unable to remain with their parents. So let me start with attachment, and let me start with identifying what my goals are in addressing this topic. I have four goals that I'd like to address while talking about attachment. The first goal is to define attachment, the types and the impact of attachment. The second goal is to explain the strengths and advantages of attachment in kinship families. The third goal is to recognize the children's capacities, levels, and degrees of attachment. And the fourth is to develop and provide approaches for mediating and strengthening the children's attachments with you. So let's talk about that definition. If you were to Google attachment, you probably would find what I call 2-part definitions for attachment. The first part of that definition is that attachment is feelings between you and your children based on how well you, the caregiver, meets the needs of their children. And I'll repeat that again. The first part of attachment is the feelings between you and the children. And those feelings are based on how well you meet the needs of your children. The second part of that definition is that these feelings that the children have about how well you're taking care of them, they fall within a range. And that range is secure attachments, which is where the children are feeling that their needs are being met and they're feeling very confident in your ability to meet their needs. And the other extreme is insecure attachment. And that's where the children are not feeling positive about how their needs are being met. In fact, they're feeling very negative about how their needs are met and are not feeling sure about your ability to care for you. So if you put these two parts together around attachment, it sounds like this. Attachment is the feelings between you and your children based on how well you're caring for your children. And that those feelings fall in a range between secure attachments where they're feeling positive about how well you're caring for them, and insecure attachments, which is when they're feeling frightened or insecure and feeling negative about how well you're caring for them. Now, if you Google again attachments, you're probably going to come up with a diagram that looks very similar to this. And this diagram shows how the attachments occur. Most of the diagrams start off with identifying needs. And those needs are either met or unmet. If those needs are being met in your children or your teens or your toddlers, if they're being met, they're healthy, they're thriving, and they're hitting all those developmental milestones that you want children to reach while they're in infancy or even as teenagers or growing into young adults. If they're unmet, those needs can be life-threatening. And if those needs are not met, they can even become fatal. Those needs fall into two categories. The first category are physical needs, and those are the basic needs of food, clothing, health, shelter. And then you have emotional needs, which are needs for attention, stimulation, love, affection. If those physical needs are not met, for example, if those physical needs are being met, then you can see children growing healthy and strong. If they're not met, again, they can be very fatal. If their emotional needs, if they're met, you've got children that are growing up mentally stable, emotionally stable. But if they're unmet, you have children that are mentally unstable, children that are feeling emotionally unstable to the point of being destructive, self-destructive, and even to the point of being suicidal. The next step of that process is where you come in, and that's your response to the needs of the children. And your response falls into two categories. Either you're going to be responsive or non-responsive. But where you fall within those extremes of response, being responsive or non-responsive, depends on how predictable you are. And by predictability, I'm talking about, is there a routine? Is there a schedule to how you meet their needs? And are you consistent? And by that, I'm talking about, is there a routine that the children can depend upon that's predictable in how you respond to their needs? The third stage is satisfaction. And here we're talking about the children feeling dissatisfied at one end of the extreme or very satisfied at the other end of the extreme. Now, where they fall between those two extremes depends on whether or not they feel as though they're rewarded. And by reward, I'm talking about whether or not they're encouraged to express their feelings or discouraged to express their needs. Whether or not they're rewarded for expressing those needs or actually punished for expressing those needs. Where their feelings fall between satisfaction also depends on their feelings of being fulfilled. And by that, I'm talking about whether or not they feel as though you want to meet their needs, whether or not they feel as though they're deserving to have those needs met, or whether or not they're made to feel undeserving, and whether or not they're made to feel as though they're being a pain or being an intrusive, or if they're made to feel like a burden. And then there's that category, there's also that feeling of reassurance. And by reassurance, I'm talking about they're feeling confident in your ability to meet their needs. So it's the combination of those three things: feeling the reward, the feeling of being fulfilled, the feeling of reassurance, that will determine where they fall between satisfaction and dissatisfaction. And when you put all three of those things together, which are needs, your response, and their feelings of satisfaction, that will determine where they fall in terms of feeling secure or insecure. Now, let me stop there and see if anybody might have any questions.
I do have one question here. It says, can you develop secure attachments with children if you don't have secure attachments yourself?
Wow. To that question, I'm saying yes. But it starts with doing just what that person did and asking that question, which is being able to recognize that they have had insecure attachments in their own life. And by being able to recognize that, you can then ask the question, what needs were not met? And by asking what needs were not met, you're going to then be able to ask, what would have made me feel that the needs were being met? And then you can begin then. You can begin by giving the children what you didn't receive. You can begin by giving the children what would have made you feel complete and satisfied. So that's where I would start in terms of answering that question. The other thing is, if you're feeling insecure attachments, but you're not sure how to respond to the children, ask them what they need. What's going to make them feel safe and protected? That's the other places you can start.
Okay, and I have another one here. It says, how do I know if my child has attachment issues or if something else is the problem?
You might want to start with looking at what were the unmet needs that resulted in the children coming into care. Asking that question will allow you to identify if the children's behavior is in response to unmet needs or something else. If those needs that were unmet resulted in them coming into care, and if you're seeing the effects of those needs, then you're probably talking about insecure attachments.
And one more. I have a number of the attitudes from insecure attachments. How can I prevent my grandchildren from sharing those beliefs?
I think if you can talk to the children about what you've learned and how you're feeling different and how you're thinking different, then I think that sharing with them gives them a role model of how to look at things differently. You provide the example. You provide the new thoughts. You provide the new feelings. Be the model for the children in terms of what are positive attachments.
And a question here from Kelly. How can you best assist a child that has formed an attachment with an abusive parent?
First of all, I think it's important. I feel positive knowing that you're recognizing that the child can be attached to abusive parents. What's so beautiful about that question is there's another question behind that, which is how can you love someone who hurt you? And you're able, so that's the first step, being able to understand that you can love someone who has hurt you, and that you have hurt people that you've loved. So I think at that point, talking to the child about other ways of loving without hurting, other ways of loving without making someone feel pain, and then modeling that for the child. I'd like to now talk about what are the strengths of kinship attachment. Here's what I want to do. I'd like to ask you a question that I'd like you to answer in the chat. And the question is, if you were in a town or in a city and you needed help, who would you prefer asking for help? A stranger that you don't know or a relative that you don't know? Here's the question again, and you can just put in the chat. If you were lost or needed help, who would you prefer asking for help? A stranger that you don't know, or a family member that you don't know? And please tell me why. So take a few minutes to answer that question. Who would you prefer and why? And Candy will also read back those responses.
Okay, for the most part, I am seeing relative because it has an element of trust there. But there are a few that have put stranger down, but most of them are coming in as relative.
Okay. And the reasons that you're starting to see, Candy?
Because they haven't met them. You're hoping that the relative has some sort of connection with you, a little safer environment, sense of trust, general trust because they are a family member, even if you haven't met them. They know your family history, culture, and traditions. You just feel safer with a relative. They may not be judgmental. Really good ones on here.
Yeah, they just covered half of my workshop. Okay, no, you've just identified the strengths of kinship attachment. That's what those reasons, and that's why I'm smiling, because it kind of validates for me why kinship attachments are so strong and what are the strengths and what are the advantages that you have as a kinship caregiver. So let me kind of summarize what you said. You know what? Let me share this with you. I had the opportunity of working with children that were moving from foster care to adoption. So I had a chance to work with children that we were preparing for adoption. And one of the hardest things for us to do with the children was getting them to believe that a stranger wanted to meet their needs, that a stranger wanted to take care of them. And when they would meet prospective adoptive parents, that was our work for weeks, for months, for days, trying to get them to believe that this stranger wants to take care of them and wants to meet their needs. And they would constantly, after every meeting they would ask me, why do they want to do this? When the children that I was working with that were going into kinship care and they would meet relatives, they were just like you. Once they knew that that person was a relative, they automatically, not that they didn't test the relative, but they automatically assumed and assigned an expectation that if you are a relative, they expected you to be loyal to them. They expected that you would have obligations for them. They expected you to want to feel responsible for them. They expected you to want to share your culture with them. So in kinship care, it's the child's expectation of what you will do as a relative that is the strength of kinship care. The advantage that you have over foster and adoptive parents is that the children expect you, and the children answer that question, why do you want to meet my needs? And they answer very simply by saying, your family. Now, they will test you. There's no question about it, okay? But they start with that expectations. And just as you said, once they expect that you want to care for them, they're then able to trust you. And what they're trusting is your motivation. They're assuming that your motivation is unconditional. They're assuming that you're going to be unselfish because you're a family, that you're going to want to willingly protect them. They're going to assume that you have their best interest in mind, and they assume and they trust that you're going to be consistent and predictable. What's so important is to understand that in kinship care, the strength of kinship care is the children's expectations of you. And then the children trusting that you're going to care for them, which then allows them to want to pursue and continue to have an attachment with you. That's the strength and that's the advantage of kinship care. Now, I want to ask you to be involved in another exercise. I'm going to ask you to go back to when the children first came to your home. And I want you to go back to remembering what were the needs that were not met that resulted in them not being able to stay with their parents and that resulted in them coming into your care. So let me repeat that again. I want you to recall what were the unmet needs of the children that resulted in them coming into your care. And by unmet needs, I'm talking about, was there the need for protection from abuse or physical harm? Was there a need for protection from being neglected? Was there a need for food or clothes or shelter? Those basic needs, those physical needs that resulted in them coming into care. Or was there a lack of supervision or lack of protection from drug exposure, from inappropriate behaviors in the family? What were those needs? What were those unmet needs that resulted in them coming into care and not being able to stay with the parents? Now I'd like you to ask yourself the question, after you think about why they came into care, is what were their attitudes like and what were their feelings like when they came into your home because of those unmet needs? Recall that. The attitudes and the feelings because of unmet needs. And then I want you to think about, after they were with you for a while, how did those attitudes and feelings change, if at all? So in the chat, I'd like you to begin the first sentence in your chat with, when they first came in, attitudes and feelings were, and then listed. So that's the first part of your chat. That's the first sentence in your chat. When they first came, attitudes and feelings were, and then list them. And in the second part of your chat, I'd like you to write, and then after a while, the feelings and attitudes were, and then listed. Okay? So that's the chat, two-part chat. When they first came, their feelings and attitudes were, and then list. And the second part of the chat is, and then after a while or later on, their feelings and attitudes were, and then listed. Because I'm going to use that information to look at how insecure attachments affect attitudes and feelings. So take a minute to do that, please. And Candy, I'll take your lead. You let me know when you want to give me that information about attitudes and feelings.
Okay. Well, first, I'll just do a real quick recap on some of the reasons the children were brought in.
Excellent.
There's as they're preparing that other answer. Protection from abuse and neglect. There were developmental concerns, behavioral concerns, and housing security.
Okay.
Incarcerated parents. Emotional bonds, emotional and physical safety of the child. So those were some of the ones that were listed for concerns of children coming in. Okay, and then Juliet responds with, when they first came in, attitudes and feelings were frustrated and concerned, and after a while, the feelings and attitudes were some relief.
Okay.
Krista responds with, when they first came in, they were quite apathetic, shut down with emotions, and later on, they opened up to me more.
Great.
Amanda responds with, when they first came in, attitudes and feelings were scared and pushing boundaries, and they were some relief. Attitudes of anger and defiance.
Defiance. Okay.
Deborah responds, when they first came in, attitudes were uncertainty, afraid to express their needs, very quiet and kept to themselves. Mary says, currently I'm the target of aggression and frustration. He doesn't like rules and schedules. Melba says, when they first came into their care, feelings and attitudes were scared and anxious. Diane responds, they came in because of drug use. When he first came in, he said thanks, he needed help. After a while, he was confused about mixed messages from the bio dad, using drugs, and then spewing negativity and doubt, then did not want to ask for any more help, anything more.
Okay.
And there's still more coming in.
Okay, this is great. All right. If some good ones come out, Candy, that just grab you, just jump right in, okay, and share them with me, okay?
Attitudes of feeling, frustrations, and abandonment.
At first, those were the at first attitudes, okay.
now feeling safety and protected.
Okay.
When they first came in, attitudes of feeling confused and conflicted. Then after a while, they accepted the situation and focused on family activities.
Okay.
They were able to accept and receive affection, but always kept a bag packed in the case just in case.
That's great. Okay. Always kept a bag ready to go.
All
Okay.
right, so we're going to stop there and let you continue on a little bit.
Thanks, Candy. They were terrific. Okay. I think it's real apparent that attachments have an effect on happiness. Attachments have an effect on how people feel about themselves in terms of feeling that they belong. I think just based on what we heard, you could hear that attachments have an impact on people's sense of self-worth, self-esteem, and importance. If we go back to those views and attitudes that you heard, depending on the unmet needs, before children were feeling unsafe, and then they